All right, guys, let's go over 6A things. I'm going to go over kind of the most important parts of the chapter for part 6A, and also kind of go into a little bit of synthesis details at the end. So make sure you kind of watch and wait for that and start to see if you can apply the things in this slide right here. Make sure you're able to, as you're taking notes, working on your note card, filling in your study packet, um, make sure you can understand these different levels of complexity in terms of organizations of species, and kind of look at how it goes from individuals to populations, communities, things like that. See how they interact with the environment. Discuss the characteristics of populations. Are they, how quickly do they reproduce? How quickly do they not? What's their longevity? What's their survivability? Contrast the effects of density-dependent and density-independent factors on population growth. So things that will come in and change the rate of growth, right? So we have to look at things that are dependent upon the density of the species and things that are not, right? So just kind of think about these, put these in your mind as you go through. All right, so population, the individuals that belong to the same species and live in a given area at a particular time. So it's important to note that I can have mountain lions, right, that are a little bit geographically isolated because of breaks in the environment, maybe lakes, streams, and things like that. And so it's very possible that even though I have, like, say, a bunch of panthers over here, and each one of these dots represents panthers, if there is some dividing line in the middle, even though these are the same species, these are going to be separate populations, right? Because they're going to interact and have different environments. I might have, these type of trees over here, which give rise to these type of small animals. And I might have these red trees over here, right? Slightly different because maybe the wind, right? The leeward wind, maybe this is the mountain, right? Top of the mountain right here. So I might get rain over here and a shadow of the rain right here. So these trees might give me these little purple creatures, and so that's going to change perhaps the way that these develop genetically. Now I get some speciation that way, right? Okay, community, all the populations of organisms within a given area, we know about this a little bit already. Population ecology, the study of factors that cause populations to increase or decrease. Okay, so right here, this is where we start talking about the rates of increase. This is going to end up leading to mathematics for this chapter. All right, so here's a nice little convenient graph of what this looks like. Starts at the individual. So the question might ask, like, if you are looking at the survivability of a single organism, if you're looking at the biology of a single organism, that would be individual level study. Our population is looking at what's going to happen to a entire group of the same species if something were to occur. Let's see, community. This is multiple species interacting, multiple populations. Ecosystem is the flow of all matter and energy. The biosphere is the entire planet. Okay, so make sure that you understand the definition of each one of these, because there are questions that are going to ask, what type of scientific study would this be, right, depending on the situation. So make sure you're able to go through your textbook and look at different examples of that. All right. Populations have distinct characteristics. You need to know these letters here that are going to be given. These are variables that you need to know. Population size, the total number of individuals within a defined area at a given time. The population density, which is something that can affect positively or negatively the population size, right? The number of individuals per unit area given time, right? This can help make your population grow very rapidly. But then after a while, if you take in other factors other than the ideal conditions, you can have, slow growth where you have high rate here, and then you have a leveling off, right? So population density, the more dense my population is, the higher the J-curve can be, steeper the J-curve can be, right? A population distribution, a description of how individuals are distributed with respect to each other. So this right here, you kind of have proximity based on comfort or maybe protection, right? You have like meerkats that'll be kind of grouped together real close, so that way they can see like a bird or something coming by, or like a hawk, right? And then to swoop down and eat these guys over here, right? So these groups might help a lot. Then you have other animals like birds and things like that want to nest, and they want to make sure they have enough room apart, so they'll have kind of nice even spatial grouping. Then of course you have random grouping as well. Sex ratio, the ratio of males to females in a population. This is important because females, basically the number of females determine the number of offspring. So this tells you how quickly you can repopulate, how quick you can repopulate, and also just how many offspring you expect to have in the next generation, right? Age structure. This one is probably a little bit more indicative of how quickly a population can regenerate, right? Because if you have a lot of young, you have a high youth population, right? This is going to lead to high birth rate, right? And the opposite is also true. Places like Japan that have a much higher proportion of old people, we call that the graying of society in Japan. They're going to run into some issues, especially since they are kind of a little bit xenophobic. They don't really like too many immigrants over there. So something's going to have to change in the future. Otherwise, they're all going to be, Gundams and Ninja Turtles in Japan. It's great. All right. Population size is affected by density. So this is in your reading packet right here. And density independent factors. So let's look at the density dependent factors. These are your plus and minuses, your inputs, right? A factor, the density dependent factor, a factor that influences the probability of survival, and reproduction in a manner that depends on the size of the population. So you kind of have to think of, let's see if there's some examples here. No. Okay, so some examples of density dependent factors are going to be resources, right? Your resources. So what resources can you imagine for animals would be density dependent factors, right? So if you have like rain, right, or water, so you have water that isn't replenished as quickly as the number of species in the given area or the size of the population in the given area can consume. So if this water is not readily replenished at the same rate that the population is consuming it, then this is going to limit the survival and reproduction. That makes sense, right? Another one would obviously be food, right? Nesting, right? This is very important. Nesting areas. That's kind of gross. Nesting / habitat, right? There's a finite number of owls that can live in the same tree, right? So if the number of trees is not increasing at the same rate that the owls are, you're going to have so you can end up with a curve like this, right? So the rate you have in small populations, you end up with this nice J curve, and you'll probably end up plateauing at a certain point, right? Now, density independent factors. Now, these are interesting here. These are mostly one-time events. These are usually one-time events. These are natural disasters, like hurricanes, volcanoes, freezes, and blizzards. They don't matter, right? So it doesn't matter if you have a really high number of species or a low number of the same individuals. A hurricane is going to kill a bunch of them, right? So it's really not density dependent. Why is food and water density dependent? Because if I have a small population of, let's say, deer, I'm going to use deer, and then I decrease the amount of food, but there was already plentiful food before, you might not see a decrease in the deer population, right? So you have to be very, very careful with that, right? Okay. Population growth models. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about growth models. These are the different type of curves we're gonna talk about, and we're going to get into a little bit of what we're talking about, density dependent and density independent factor. We're going to talk about carrying capacity here. All right, so let's look at that. Okay, so as you read this, as you go through your notes in your book, make sure you understand that growth of populations can sometimes be modeled as exponential, and that's a J-shaped curve. That's what I've been showing you in the previous couple of slides of J-shaped curve, right? That's a nice one. This is actually a really high population growth here. Okay, describe how logistic growth model incorporates carrying capacity and produces an S-shaped curve. So this is kind of what I was telling you about before with the plateau, right? And this takes into account some sort of asymptotic relationship right here. Right? This right here, this approaching the limit here would be the carrying capacity. So I'm kind of giving you a really big overview of the entire thing. That's okay. K for carrying capacity. Compare reproductive strategies and survivorship curves with different species. And we're talking, when we mean reproductive strategies, we are talking about number of offspring, how late in the game they mature sexually, things like that. And dynamics and metapopulations. Metapopulations is kind of important, and we'll talk about that. This has to do with clustered groups of populations, whether they are artificial or natural. Okay? All right. So exponential growth model describes populations that continuously increase. So this is like really, really ideal. Okay? Population growth models, mathematical equations can be used to predict population size at any moment in time. And this is we're going to introduce this, and we're going to do like a little lab activity with this. So the population growth rate, you see this right here, we're getting into some numbers and variables. Don't be too afraid of them, they're really not that bad. Number of offspring that an individual can produce in a given time period minus the deaths of the individual or its offspring during the same time period. So when we get into like population graphs where we look at like the distribution of age, this is going to be important, right? So a country that might have a shape that looks kind of like this, we start from young to old, right? So we would have a lot, especially in this sweet spot area right here, where we have probably the mature portion of the population that can reproduce. We have a lot more in this part of the growth section than we do, let's say, in the older part that's going to die off, right? So this plus right here would not be minused too much, and I know that's a really, really bad way of saying that, but that kind of helps a little bit, as opposed to something that looks more like this, right? Even if it's just a little bit more at the bottom, right? You end up with, obviously these guys at the very bottom aren't quite reproduction age yet, but let's say that we are realistically able to, this part of the population reproduces, right? So this would be my plus, then up here, with minus, and you have a much sizable proportion of that population which is gone compared to that. You see that? So the area of blue that's overlapped here is much smaller than the area of blue here, right? So that kind of goes into that population growth rate. All right, intrinsic growth rate. So intrinsic, this is the ideal, the maximum potential. We don't care about anything in chemistry. This would be like in the presence of abundant blank, whatever, oxygen, whatever. So you have basically an unlimited resources. This is going to give you that really, really nice, awesome J-curve, right? And it's going to be different for every species based on their reproductive methods, right, or their strategies. Okay, exponential growth rate model. Here is the equation for it. So the number, n just means number, the number at a given time, so any time that you want to figure out the population, is equal to the base number, so the starting numbers of individuals, times the E rate to the RT power, right? So the rate, so this is the R is the rate, and T is the amount of time. It can be years, it can be seconds, depending on the type of population. What's important to note here is, since you don't get to use a calculator, you need to know that E is 2.72. 2.72. I will find out for you if you can round this to 2.7 or maybe even 3. I'm not sure if you can go that crude, but 2.72 is a little bit more doable than trying to figure out what that is. Now, you'll have to know how to figure out the rate of a population with this equation. You might have to know how to graph using this, so make sure you're comfortable with exponential graphs, right? All right. So that's what all these mean. Okay, J-shaped curves, the exponential growth model when graphed. Okay. All right, here we go. Here's a graphical representation of that. So here's the slope. The slope of this is the rate, right? The slope of this is the rate of population growth. And what is happening over time? Well, as the population is, so here's the slope, rise over run, rise over run. So look what's happening. It's getting steeper, rise over run, rise over run, rise over run, and so forth, right? So what's happening over time is the rate is increasing. And why is that? Well, if you remember when we were talking about speciation mutations, well, I have this point and this point, I have a higher number of species. My population is increasing. So that means the mating is increasing. Let's say we have a species that gives 2 to 3 young per mating season, or mating period, right? That means if I have, let's say, 2 here and let's say 8 here, so let's use the biggest numbers. 2 by 3, 6. 2 by 3 is what? That's 24, right? So that's a whole lot more than that, right? So we are increasing quite a bit the number of species that can be given per generation, right? So that's why we get this exponential growth model. Okay, logistical growth model. So of course, with abundant resources, you're going to have this really out of control exponential growth. That's really, really nice, but realistically, you don't get that. That's the logistic growth model, and you're taking into account the amount of resources and the carrying capacity. Okay, you're taking into the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is based off of the limiting resources, so the resource the population cannot live without. And if it's in quantities lower, you have to decrease the size of the population. Okay? So it's initially exponential when the population is low. So what you need to know here, initially exponential because the population is low, right? It slows as the population approaches the carrying capacity of the environment. And this Russian scientist, the name of, I think, the name was Gase, he did this thing with paramecium in a test tube and found that the carrying capacity was limited by a resource, which was food, right? So the more food he put in there, the higher the rate of increase. And in each case, he ended up with a logistic growth model, right? Because after a while, there just wasn't enough food, right? So the population growth stays off and becomes constant, right? So in both cases, he had, so let's make red the first case. So he had something like that, right? But when he doubled the amount of food, he ended up doubling the population, right? But at the end, you still ended up with a carrying capacity, okay? And that gives you an S-shaped curve, right? I know it's kind of a bad S-shape, but oh well. Deal with it. Okay, so here's a better one, if you like this one better. Study this. Cool. Food becomes scarce or other conditions change, a population can experience fluctuations. So let's talk about if you have species that are selected. These are guys that reproduce like crazy. They have young breeding ages, they have maybe low life expectancy, and they have a very high amount of youth. And they can, maybe they mate at just only certain times a year. They can end up having more food or more of the limiting resource at one period of time. They have high amount of food maybe when they mated, but maybe the food decreased with birth, right, during the birthing period. So if that happens, what's going to happen is you're going to overshoot the amount of population that the environment can carry, right? So the carrying capacity is lower than the amount that you have currently. So what happens is you end up with a rapid decline because they can't eat and survive. That's called the die-off, right? And the graph for that looks like this. Okay, so we end up with carrying capacity maybe up here, and you end up with, oh yeah, there's a lot of food right now. So bam, all the way up here, but then they die off. And then maybe have a little bit more food again. You end up with this pattern, right? Just kind of going over and under. So it's possible to go above the carrying capacity, but just not for very long, right? And if you were to imagine kind of like our planet, right? Do you think we are more in the exponential growth? Are we in the logistical growth curve where we're reaching sustainability, or are we more kind of approaching maybe this situation right here, right? We're just about to go this way. And obviously different countries are going to die off a little bit different than others, right? Because of how affluent we are. You know, so that's kind of something to think about, right? I mean, that's kind of a synthesis question right there, so make sure you know that. All right, so here we go. I kind of jumped the gun a little bit, but let's talk about the reproductive strategies. We have K-selected species. They have low intrinsic growth rate. That means their curve is going to look more like, it's going to be exponential, right? But it's going to be very slow, right? And then you have your R-selected species, high intrinsic growth rate. You have the overshoots and die-offs here, right? And this is going to reach carrying capacity eventually. Right, something like that. This guy right here is going to have something that looks more like what we talked about before. Right. All right, here's a graph of this. You have this in your textbook. You need to know this. Why are they K-selected? Why is the population just not low all the time for K-selected species? Well, they have essentially the opposite of R-selected species. Their lifespan is long, whereas the R-selected species is short. Their time to reach maturity, long, short. Reproductive events is few, many. So think about some creatures that are like this, right? Larger mammals, right? Like humans, elephants, gorillas. They only maybe mate a couple times here and there. Number of offspring is few. Bats are going to be in this too. A lot of these bats, like the ones who did in your FRQ. Size of offspring are large, right? Baby elephants like 200 pounds. It's crazy. Parental care is there. You see like little pachyderms taking their babies around. Population growth rate is slow. And these guys, what you need to know about this is that they have higher survivability per species, right, over time. Right? And that's what we're talking about here with lifespan. So the population just isn't always low because they give birth to fewer offspring. They also survive a little bit longer too, right? Like wolves and whales. But at the same time, imagine, look at this here, density-dependent population regulation, right? So if something that is population density dependent occurs, right, like you lose a lot of your limiting resources from habitat destruction, right? So if you can think of the effects of habitat destruction, maybe like hunting, poaching, think of some other things that kind of happen, right? These guys are not going to recover as quickly, right? The K-select are not going to recover as quickly. And so they have a much higher probability of becoming extinct than R-selected species, such as rats, mice, rodents, things that humans consider pests, right? Population dynamics are highly variable. This is when you get that, right, that die-off curve. Stable near carrying capacity, right? And it's carrying capacity right there. Okay, let's take a look at some other stuff here. Survivorship curve. What you need to know about survivorship curves is these are essentially the, they're backwards from the growth curve, right? They're backwards growth curves. All right, and type 1 is high survival through most of the lifespan. So your type 1 is going to be your K or R select. Use your K select, right? Type 2 survivorship curve, we'll talk about that in a second. Type 3 survivorship curve is a survival time, low survivorship early in life. Few individuals reaching adulthood. This right here is going to be your R-selected species. And here is kind of a mixture of the two. You have like squirrels and things like that that are just kind of like on a constant decline, right? So you end up with something that looks kind of like that, right? So let's take a look at this. Whereas the type 3, which we said was R-select, type 1 was K-select. So you remember the growth curve of the K-selected was like this, right? Let's use the blue. So I'm going to do the growth curve, right? The growth curve was like that, right? Very slow. Look at it now. The survivorship is very, very slow to decline, right? So it's basically the flipped version of it, right? Now look at the growth curve exponentially, right? The growth curve exponentially was like what? It was, bam. So you basically just flip this around, right? Because they grow so quickly and have so many offspring, they are going to die off really quickly as well, right? It's purple for that, right? And let's see if I can just be weird. Yeah, there it is. See? Flipped. All right, cool. A couple more slides here. All right, so let's talk about interconnected populations and metapopulations that we were talking about earlier with different cougars on different parts of the same mountain that maybe only like to hang out around certain trees because their food is there. They end up creating these metapopulations. They're spatially distinct populations connected by occasional movements of individuals between them, and they do that for things like corridors, right? So if you make a corridor, so let's say you got all these trees here, they like to live in these trees. You have another group of trees over here. Here are all the little cougars, right? All right, but they don't like open land because there isn't a lot of food here, so they'll naturally stay there. But if you were to say build like some, not build, but maybe some other trees happen to grow just right here, now they've made like a little bridge, right? So you made corridors for them to want to come over, which is important because if these guys start dying off, right? If these guys start dying off, right, they're gone. Now I'm only down to 2. Oh no. So some of these guys that were over here originally, even though they're a little bit different perhaps, now they can kind of come over because they have a corridor to do that, right? So human beings create metapopulations by fragmenting the ecosystem. So it's important that if we do that, we keep in mind that we want to have some sort of continuous natural bridge for these guys to go over, right? The inbreeding depression, so when metapopulations happen, when the population gets really low, right, like right here, now there's less genetic diversity. And you end up with harmful mutations that can be passed on. If both parents have the same harmful genes, right, they can pass those alleles on, and it can be very bad. And here's the example of that, right? Here are these corridors. Right? But the natural barrier here is going to make these guys a little bit distinct. Okay, so here's some interesting things, right, about how humans change the environment. So here's an example of that, right? So these deer, they maybe like to feed on grass, right? They like to feed on open fields. These used to be forests. But what's happening here is, since we've made it into like grazing pasture, we are going to increase the carrying capacity, right? The carrying capacity is increased because there's much more grazing land for them to have. That throws off the entire ecosystem, right? there might not be enough predators to take care of these guys. Now these guys are going to be getting into your cornfields, eating up everything. That's going to affect the economy. It's going to affect the prices of corn because there's less. You end up having to spend money to get rid of these guys. How do we get rid of these guys, right? How do we get rid of things like kangaroos that are taking over military bases? This really happened. So they went through and the military shot 6,000 out of 9,000 of these kangaroos. Everybody got really mad. We don't like to shoot and kill things, but what do? It's not going to be humane. They're killing off the plant life that other things depend on, right? So we don't know, right? You can have a debate over which method of population control you use, but it has to be done, right? I don't know about killing, but there are other methods such as administering. Yeah, like this lady's pretty hardcore, right? She is shooting birth control darts. Birth control darts. Don't you wish you'd probably, shoot some animals that are, well, a sneaky neighbor dog or something? Shoot it with the dart that has birth control in it, and now you're reducing the growth rate, right? The only problem with that is these are kind of expensive, right? This is a little bit pricey. It's not practical for third world countries, right? Some of these darts can range anywhere between $200 to $600 per dart. Can you imagine, places in the world, people maybe make about the equivalent of 6,000 a year. That's a big proportion of your money, right? So it's not always very practical, right? Conservation consumptive, whoa, sometimes lead to this. Let's conservate, right? Yeah, not really. But people with birds, right? You obviously can't shoot a bird with a dart that weighs that has the same mass as the bird, right? It'll obliterate it. That's one way of you're back to this, right? If you're doing that, you're basically back to this situation, right? You don't want that. But you can administer oral contraceptives to birds, but that's also kind of difficult because how do you track them? You just throw it all over the place, and then what are you going to do if species that aren't taking over, get a hold of that stuff, right? So these are all issues that we really have to think about. They affect us, and it has to be dealt with, but the methodology of how we do that is definitely up to debate. All right, guys.